Welcome to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here's Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
All right, so today I'm excited to talk to Dr. Liz Lin. Liz is a psychologist, a writer, and the co-founder of Progressive Asian American Christians. She has a PhD in clinical psychology, as well as master's degree in psychology and theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. Previously, she taught in Fuller's Graduate School of Psychology, Newbigin House of Studies, and the Faith and Justice Network. She lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Liz, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul.
Well, excited to have you. You are doing so many exciting things professionally, and I've tried to follow your work over the years, but it's hard to keep up, which is a good thing. It means that you're doing lots of good things. And as I read in your bio, you were previously with the Newbigin House of Studies, the Faith and Justice Network, and you co-founded Progressive Asian American Christians. For our listeners and myself, could you describe these two organizations, and as well as what they stand for and what they do?
Sure. So I'll start with Progressive Asian American Christians, or PAC, which I co-founded with Lydia Hsu and for which I serve as the director. PAC is a community for Asian American Christians who identify as progressive, whether that's theologically, socially, politically. And there's not a lot of spaces, as you might know, for Asian American Christians who identify in this way, because most Asian American Christian spaces tend to be quite conservative. So this is a place for people who are feminist and queer affirming or queer identifying and Asian American and Christian, or, ex-Christian, or wherever they are in their journey, can just show up as their full selves, not have to check any of those identities at the door, and just be seen and learn and grow together. PAC started out as a primarily online thing on Facebook, but has since grown into an IRL thing as well. There's local meetups around the world. There's, annual conference. There used to be an online intentional learning community, and so on. And then Newbigin House of Studies is now the Faith and Justice Network. And it is a year-long program for folks who are discerning if they want to go into seminary or in seminary or early career clergy, to get kind of an intentional, progressive Christian, year of development. And there are, I think, quite a few programs like this that are more conservative, but there really isn't anything like this for Christians who identify as progressive or in the process of deconstructing their faith. It's run by Peter Choi, who is a dear friend and colleague of mine, and he does an incredible job of just highlighting, really centering voices of marginalized people. So lots of the speakers and leaders are people of color, are queer, and there's really nothing like it. It's also primarily online. It's got 3 intensive opportunities throughout the year that are in person, but I was really lucky to be able to teach in that program as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And wow, what amazing work by the two organizations that you talked about. I'm intrigued by the term progressive attached to Asian American Christian. That word can mean all kinds of things. In fact, I'm going to read a quote from a Sojourners interview that you did. And here's a quote. "I think the toughest challenge we've had is trying to thread this needle of how progressive means different things to different people, and it's inherently a relative term. So what is progressive in some communities is not even remotely progressive in other communities." I totally agree that people and communities interpret the word progressive very differently. Yeah. But like good psychologists, let's try to operationalize this term. How would you define progressive Asian American Christianity? What might that look like?
Ooh, that's such a good question, Paul. If I were to think about what it means to be progressive, I think about it less as meeting a list of criteria and more as an orientation, right? So, is it a posture? For me, it's a posture of being open to new ways of understanding, new ways of thinking, new potential challenges to your old way of thinking. as opposed to you need to meet criteria A, B, and C. And so for me, I don't know if that the language of like centered set or bounded set means anything to you or to your listeners, but it's less about like where you are specifically than more kind of like the direction you're heading in, and as I think of it. But, as that quote alludes to, it can be a little bit complicated, right? Because, there are some people who are very much the beginning of that journey, and for whom even, the idea that women can have the same leadership roles as men in the church is like a very radical progressive idea for their context, right? And then there are folks for whom that is a given, and why is it even a question, right? So like how do we make space for people who are at all stages of the journey, not just with feminism, but also with, queer affirmation and like their politics and whatever. It's been a challenge to be a place that is like safe for folks who are asking questions, but also feels safe for folks who are like much farther along on the journey.
Yeah, in that interview, you talked about that difficulty of bringing together people who are at different stages of their journey, and how if you try to include all stages, sometimes that can be something that's really difficult, because then the ones who are marginalized, the ones who are feeling frustrated might be hurt even more, right?
Exactly.
Liz, we get this messaging a lot in some Christian communities where we talk about all voices being welcome, all stages, all perspectives being welcome to the table. And I think we know where that mentality is coming from, right? But at the same time, how do you navigate that tension of welcoming all voices, but also at the same time really paying attention to marginalized voices that need that special attention, that special care?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Paul. And I think you've really like articulated the central tension in PAC, like especially in its early years, where it's like, I mean, let's use queer affirmation as an example, right? Like for some people, the idea that queer people should be allowed to get married and have leadership positions in the church is like a very radical progressive idea, but they're like exploring it for the first time, which in their particular context is like, again, very radical, especially coming from an Asian American Christian community where like, most Asian American Christian communities are not queer affirming, right? So for them, being open to this idea is like a huge step forward, right? But then we have queer members in our group where, somebody kind of unintentionally just asking these questions like, tell me about queer affirmation and like, what's the evidence for this? For them, witnessing that kind of conversation is violent even, right? It's the idea of like, why are we questioning whether or not I have the same rights and I'm entitled to the same opportunities as everybody else, right? And so that around that question specifically, I feel like we really had to make a choice where it was like, okay, there are other places on the internet where people can find the arguments for queer affirmation, but there are not really other places on the internet that are safe for queer Asian American Christians. And so we made a choice that we were going to prioritize the safety of our queer Asian American Christian members, right? So we have pretty explicit language in our guidelines that's like, we don't debate that here in the same way that we don't debate like whether or not women can be pastors, because it is violent for female pastors to have to witness people sort out whether or not they should be allowed to do what they do, right? So I feel like we have erred on the side of protecting the marginalized community over welcoming all voices at every stage. And that's also had its own consequences, right? Like there are people who are afraid to ask questions, and I can totally understand why. And we also really want to protect the marginalized voices in our community who don't have other spaces to go to. So yeah, all that to say, we would love to be able to do both. But I think, as you like very clearly articulated, like I think when the rubber meets the road, like you kind of do have to pick which one you're going to prioritize.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Liz. And I really sense that passion that you have to care for those who are marginalized, who are experiencing or have experienced violence. It kind of reminds me of also how, in racial or ethnicity related conversations, how sometimes we have to be intentional about the people who are involved in that conversation, right? So there's a time and place where all are welcome to the table, and
Yes.
there's maybe a way to do that well, but also
Yeah.
there's a time and place for what we call affinity groups, right? Or
Yes.
groups where people can feel safe without having to fear the judgment of others or invalidation of others. So it reminded me of sort of that parallel with racial or ethnicity related conversations.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent analogy, where it's like there is a time and a space for one and a time and a space for the other, and like both are important. Like, you know what I mean? Both are essential, but not every time and place is like should be open to everybody.
Right.
Because those places and spaces serve different purposes for different people.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
You know, you've already touched upon this, Liz, but can you give more context to your motivation for bringing progressive and Asian American Christianity together? Why were you passionate about doing that? Like, what kinds of life experiences, what kinds of psychological or theological frameworks informed the creation of the PAC, Progressive Asian American Christians?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like as with so many things psychology, like that psychologists get involved in, like it all started with my own experience where I just, for years, like from the time I was in seminary into my early career, I just like never felt like I belonged in church. Which was such a dramatically different experience from my early years in church. Like I became a Christian at 15 in a Taiwanese American church in like the high school ministry, you know, English speaking high school ministry. And in high school and college, like Asian American Christian spaces are where I felt most at home. But then when I was in grad school and, you know, getting my PhD in seminary, you know, in psychology, in this like psychological and theological space, I suddenly found that like church, I felt very alien everywhere I was going in church. And I couldn't totally put my finger on it until, God, like 5 years after I finished, when I was having a conversation with someone in a similar space where it was like, oh, okay, this is the issue, is that like when I go to Asian American churches now, the things that they talk about and value do not align at all with the things that I talk about and value, right? Now that I've had all this experience as a therapist and like done all of this theological deconstruction. So, and the things that I care about and value are nowhere to be seen in these Sunday mornings, right? Like I care about racial justice and I care about feminism and I care about queer rights, and like none of those things are talked about. If anything, they are sometimes often like disparaged from up front. So like those spaces became really foreign to me. And then also when I went to progressive Christian spaces, I was like the only Asian American there. Like all those churches tended to be very white. And even if they talked a good game about racial justice, like these spaces were super white, and they often had no awareness of like how deeply the whiteness was entrenched in their structures. So I also felt out of place there too. And it was from this conversation where it was like, oh, it's because I am both of these things, because I'm Asian American and progressive. Like that's what makes finding a Christian community so hard for me. So I was like working this out in my head. And then I met this pastor in San Francisco named Lydia Hsu, and who also shares all these identities. And she was like, oh, I just started this like Facebook group called Progressive Asian American Christians. It's brand new though. And I was like, oh my God, I'm like working on this piece about it. Like the language and the timing all felt like conspicuous, you know, felt really remarkable. So when I finally like wrote it out, like processed it, wrote the piece about it that I had been working out in my head, I linked her group at the bottom. And then, you know, people started joining, because turns out that there's a lot of people who feel the same way. And especially at the time that it came out, the piece went up in December 2016. So it was like right on the heels of the Trump election. And I think a lot of Asian American Christians were feeling very disillusioned with how their churches responded or didn't respond to Trump's election.
Thank you for sharing that. And it sounds like so many things came together to start that movement.
Yeah. It all felt very fortuitous.
I can tell again that you love this work. Are there any challenges or pushbacks that you have experienced because of this work with progressive Asian American Christians? Do you have any stories to share about pushbacks or criticism that you have experienced because of the work?
I mean, I feel pretty shielded from it, to be honest with you, because I feel like the people who have found PAC are the people who really needed a space like it and who really champion it, and you know what I mean, and like have been just so generous with their stories and like generous with their time and their labor, and like I feel like PAC is like a very encouraging and supportive space. But I am conscious that like when it came about, that like it was hotly debated amongst some in some Christian circles, you know, if the idea of being progressive and Christian was an oxymoron, or if the things that I like, you know, the things that I was talking about in this piece, like queer affirmation and feminism and racial justice, were in line with, you know, a Christian identity and stuff like that. So I'm sure that there's pushback out there, but I feel very shielded from it, to be honest with you. And I don't feel the need to engage with it. Like, you know, some people wrote responses or whatever, and I'm like, I don't need, this space isn't for you, right? I didn't, Lydia and I did not make this for you. And so I don't feel the need to justify its existence to you. But, you know, I do feel by and large like really supported, and really I feel like the community is like a really nourishing and life-giving space for me. So especially at this point, now that we're like 7 years in, like I don't feel like I get a lot of pushback, which is nice. And I also feel like the world has changed a little bit since 2016, where like I feel like racial justice is like, especially in the like post George Floyd world that we live in, like racial justice is not controversial in Christian circles the way that it maybe was before. I can't say the same for feminism and queer affirmation, unfortunately, but I do feel like the landscape has changed a little bit. And so, you know, the idea of being progressive is not as radical or threatening as it was in 2016.
Yeah, that's a good point. That over time, perhaps people have become more accepting and perceive progressive Asian American Christianity as less threatening or not as threatening. You mentioned the challenges or maybe being shielded from the potential criticisms, but also what are the rewards of doing this work? You touched upon the support from the community and, you know, caring for those who are marginalized, who have experienced violence. But can you speak a little bit more to the rewards of this kind of work?
Yeah. I mean, again, it all so much of it is like about just to start with my own personal experience. Like I finally feel like I have a space where like I can bring my whole self, you know, like those experiences that I talked about before of just feeling so alien in church, like I still feel that way in most churches, but in PAC spaces, I feel like I can be my full self. And that is such a gift, you know? We had our first retreat a few weeks ago since the pandemic started. So it was like our first IRL national gathering in 4 years. And it was just like, oh my God, like I feel normal for the first time in 4 years. And I don't have to explain all of these things about myself. Like everyone here is, I mean, there's immense diversity in our stories, but I don't have to explain being all three of these things, you know, like this, we're all starting from this point, like from this square together. And like, that's, I mean, what a gift, you know? But I think what's also been so meaningful for me is seeing that PAC has been that space for so many different people. And I think specifically of our queer members who really, you know, way more than me did not have spaces where they could be their full selves. and where it would actually be dangerous to them. You know, most Christian spaces were actually actively dangerous to them. And so to have facilitated a space where queer Asian American Christians can come and be their full selves is like, I mean, like that's like the honor of my life, truly, you know, and I can't take that much credit for it. Like we have like a subgroup specifically for queer Asian American Christians that's led by Serena Poon and some other folks who just do truly life-giving and life-saving work. But like the fact that there's a space now where like there's hundreds of them, and they, even though in their real lives probably feel very out of place a lot of the time, a place where like they can be their whole selves, you know, is like, that's like the most meaningful work that I can imagine, you know? So all that to say that a space where like so many of us who have felt like we just didn't belong, like have a space to belong, like that's like so deeply satisfying. And I feel very honored to be able to facilitate that kind of thing.
That's very well put. It sounds like those spaces are super valuable for all people involved, but especially those who have experienced oppression, who have experienced violence from their sometimes own church communities, right? And also valuable for people who are facilitating or leading like yourself to be able to see that. Right? You know, this is a personal question, so feel free to go as deep or not as deep as you would like, but you disclosed to me in a previous conversation that you no longer identify as an evangelical. And I know, again, it's a very loaded term, loaded question. So feel free to qualify as much as you would like, but would you share a bit about why that's the case and your journey in arriving at that?
Yeah. I think at the core of it was that I stopped believing in hell. And I mean, I think in the process of, you know, that part of my theology changing, I realized how much of evangelicalism is driven by a fear of hell and saving people from hell. And if that is no longer a thing that we are saving people from, then that really diminishes the need to evangelize. But how that journey started for me was the idea just stopped making sense to me when I was in seminary. Like this idea that, you know, God is all loving and all merciful and created all of us and delights in all of us, but would then send like 99.99999% of us to like eternal torture because we were born in the wrong place or at the wrong time. Like it just didn't make sense anymore. And, you know, I just remember, I think the more I started working with clients too, and just realizing that like, this is a purely hypothetical situation, but like, you know, if I had a client who like didn't believe in God because like they had been abused as a child and like prayed for it to stop and it never stopped. If I, as their therapist with my limited faculties, could empathize and totally understand why they didn't believe in God, I was like, how much more would God, who is all loving and all merciful and all knowing, empathize and have compassion for this person? I just like could not, it just didn't make sense to me anymore that God would condemn this person to a lifetime of punishment, you know? So I feel like those, like the whole hell thing stopped making sense. And there's also there's like so little about it in the Bible, like almost nothing in the Bible about hell, but it's I think a very useful tool if you want to keep people in line. And so, all that to say is that like I feel like that was the first, I'm mixing my metaphors in my head, that was like kind of the first shoe to drop. I don't know if that's the right metaphor, but and after that I feel like it just didn't make sense to me. And I still identified as a Christian because I still felt like, you know, the teachings of Jesus mean something for how we live now. Like they matter for how we live now. But, you know, this idea that only some of us get to experience the love of God for all of eternity, and the vast majority of us don't, is just it just stopped making sense. So that's at the core of it. It was my theology just did not fit evangelical Christianity anymore. And then of course all of the political, racist and all that stuff, I mean, also made it very easy to disaffiliate myself. But for me, it was a change in theology first and foremost that made me stop identifying as evangelical.
Thank you for sharing that. And again, I know it's deeply personal. It strikes me too that your deconstruction happened while you were in seminary.
I think that's true for a lot of people. There's like a bad, corny joke about how like seminary is cemetery because so many people, like their faith dies when they're there. But there's a little bit of truth to that, where it's like once you start really studying the Bible and the theology, and you just see that it's actually full of contradictions, and it's not this like simple, pretty package that you've been given on Sunday mornings, you start unraveling the thing a little bit. Some of the people that I went to seminary with unraveled the whole thing, and then it just unraveled, and that was it, and it was done for them. And then there are some people, and I would put myself in this camp, who like took all the thread and like made something new that fit better with their new understanding of the world and of people. But it's tough. I alluded to this before, but it's like once you've done that deconstruction work, like, going to a regular church on Sunday morning can be really hard, because sometimes the Sunday morning understanding of the Bible is just like not the same as the understanding that you've like redeveloped, And I think being a therapist only accelerated this process, at least for me, where it's like, sitting with clients in their deepest pain and like realizing that like, man, you can do everything right and still experience terrible outcomes. Like my conservative evangelical worldview just like did not have room for the things that I was like, the things that were actually happening in my clients' lives. And that's when I realized that like this is real. And so it's not the reality. This is the reality of things. So like if my worldview has to change and my understanding has to change in the face of these like lived experiences that I am getting to witness,
Yeah, those moments reflecting on a very particularly difficult client case and feeling like, oh my goodness, what did I just witness? What did I just hear? It can really be powerful in changing our worldviews, right?
Yeah. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So I know that your training was not at an explicitly
Seminary.
religious institution in the way that mine was. Yeah, but I'm curious, like, if and how your experience of like becoming a psychologist changed your theology.
So, like you, I grew up in very conservative Christian churches. My father was a missionary, he was a pastor, and in the Korean Christian setting, being a Christian means you have a certain set of social values, right? That you don't deviate from these expectations about gender, expectations about even alcohol, cigarette smoking, all these things. And so I think I internalized a lot of that, but being a psychologist and receiving training in psychology helped me sort of deconstruct those elements and not be so like behavior oriented when thinking about who is doing the will of God, right? And so not being so legalistic when it comes to thinking about my clients, not being as judgmental when interacting with my clients and my fellow churchgoers. I think psychology helped me do that. And like you mentioned, learning about trauma and how it could really impact one's well-being, right, and mental health, helped me understand that some people just have lives that are so painful and they're not choosing to do things a certain way, right, but they have been shaped in a way where maybe they're more inclined to exhibit certain behaviors or do things that might be hurtful to other people without knowing it. So it gave me more empathy for those who are impacted by mental health issues. Yeah. I wouldn't say psychology has led me to walk away from Christianity, but it allowed me to examine and re-examine some of those internalized beliefs about what a Christian should be, what it means to be a good follower of God, those kinds of things.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate you articulating that. And what you said about like how people's trauma especially can shape their choices and behaviors, I think that resonates really deeply with me. I think because in the way that I grew up, like, or my, early religious years, it was all like, we have choices and there's good choices and bad choices. And I feel like I kind of maybe implicitly got the message that these choices all exist in a vacuum, right? And like we're all starting in the same field and making, all of our choices are like somehow objective or unimpacted by our context. But like I feel like becoming a therapist and hearing people's stories, especially the ones that were like painful, it's like, oh, actually, like sometimes you don't really have a choice. And sometimes like people end up in situations because like they didn't really have other options. And I think just like having this kind of understanding of how our past shapes our present, which then shapes our future, I think just it gave me a lot more empathy, as you said. And also, really messed up my theology, my old theology. It couldn't hold this. And so as a result, my theology had to change.
Yeah, that hyper-individualism that characterizes mainstream American culture, where we think that if you did something wrong, you're solely responsible. Or if you did something right, then you are to be praised for doing that. But as you mentioned, that's sort of disconnected from the context or the background or the historical factors that might have went into that behavior. So
exactly.
Going back to my theology, I feel like I am more embracing of the fact that we can think about individual sins, but also collective sins, the way that sin manifests beyond the person to a community, right? And so I think psychology has taught me that, which is ironic because psychology is very individualistic.
Yes, sure.
At least being in like multicultural psychology, being in counseling, it has allowed me to see sort of a more systemic perspective on different things.
Yes. How we are shaped by systems,
right,
and how
right,
systems shape our behavior. Yeah, I totally relate to that.
And I feel like in my Korean and Korean American church settings, that was not emphasized. It was all about what you do as a person, as one person. You have the freedom to choose, and if you choose the wrong thing, then you only have yourself to blame. That kind of mentality I think was very prominent.
Which is so interesting because like, I mean, same in my Taiwanese American church context. And it's so interesting because it's like, Taiwanese and Korean cultures are in and of themselves like so collective, right? But it's like the theology that we were given was this like white Western colonizer missionary theology that we then, our communities like just ate up, right? And then even though it was completely at odds in some ways with our cultures, but we were told that like this is actually correct, and so.
Oh, and then any other variations or deviation from that type of Christianity is criticized as lesser than, right? So
totally
like that sort of colorblind or culture blind Christianity is elevated, and then anything else is criticized or viewed as maybe not even as Christian. So
right
yeah, I totally get that. Yeah, it's
really unfortunate because it's kind of like a colonized mindset, right? Like this idea that like, this like white Western theology we were given, like it must be better and it must be the best, right? Like, and our own cultural traditions are actually all bad. And like, I have a lot of grief about that for the ways in which like, our own cultural expressions were like bulldozed and continue to be like, I don't know, like, there's so many Christian leaders in our communities who look at these like cultural traditions and call them, heresy And
Mm,
like,
mm.
yeah, it's heartbreaking, I think.
It, it is, yeah. This
Yeah.
is a bit of a tangent, but my research team did a study on implicit associations people make with images of Jesus, and we focused on
Interesting.
Asian American Christians. So people who are Christian, who identify as Asian American, and maybe not surprisingly, images of white Jesus were rated much more favorably compared to images of non-white Jesus. And so
Ooh.
even that says something about, because like if you ask these people, like, do you think white Jesus image is better than these other images, they wouldn't say
Right.
that it's better, right? But
Yeah.
implicitly they've internalized the message that white Jesus is the standard. It should be looked at more favorably. And so
Yeah.
I thought that was a telling finding from our study, that for Christians who claim to be racially colorblind, still white Jesus was much more favorable compared to more negative words associated with non-white Jesus.
Wow. That's wild,
Yeah.
Paul.
I keep telling pastors it matters also what images we use on our bulletins, on
Yes.
PowerPoints.
Yes.
But one of my pet peeves is seeing white Jesus images during sermons in a Korean American church. But
Yes.
I think I'm in the minority in terms of people who are bothered by it.
Yeah. Yeah. You probably are.
Yeah.
But for whatever it's worth, I'm very bothered. It reminds me of the doll study, right? Like from the 60s, where black children favored white dolls over black dolls. Like the parallels there. Only this is their image of God.
Right,
And like,
right.
what does that, I mean, just there's a whole book in there to unpack that, right?
Yeah, there's a lot there. But thank you
Yeah.
for indulging me in that conversation about
No.
implicit association.
Yeah. And just, God, I mean, I could talk about this for a long time.
Yeah, but I again appreciate you sharing about your journey and the nuances there in terms of where you were theologically and now where you are currently in terms of your theology. So thanks, Liz. You know, you write a lot, you're an activist, and you also are an educator, meaning you're not like lecturing in the college campus, right? I mean, I know that you've taught in higher education before, but currently you're not in a traditional classroom, but you're still educating in more effective ways outside of the walls of the classroom. I'm curious, because this podcast focuses on teaching about culture, if you have any kind of broad suggestions for how educators can integrate more progressive Asian American Christian voices into their teaching, and then also if you have concrete suggestions, are you willing to share that?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the conversation we just had is an excellent springboard into this, where it's just like, however you identify as an educator, like, please bring as many different voices as possible into your curriculum. Because I went to seminary, I finished seminary, God, 13 years ago. So, I mean, not super recently, but still pretty recently. And like, I think I can count on one hand the number of texts that I read by non-white theologians. And this was at a seminary in, Southern
Southern
California,
California.
in LA, that's always, that pats itself on the back for being so interdenominational and interracial and all that. And like, I really think it is the job of the educator to put as many different perspectives in front of their students as possible. Like, you're the gateway. And these kids, I mean, aside from like TikTok and whatever, like, they're not going to find these resources on their own. So I really think that it behooves educators to be putting as many different voices as in front of their students as possible, which means that you have to be reading lots of different voices. And if you are not, then you need to do some self-examination about why you are not. And it's not just white educators who are guilty, right? Like, even Asian American educators are often, and pastors are guilty of putting only white voices in front of their students or congregations. And so, and when we live in a time when, thanks to the internet, there, maybe 40 years ago that could be excusable because there weren't the voices of theologians of color were harder to access. But now, thanks to the internet, you can find them. And so, if that means that instead of assigning a book, you assign some long form pieces or you assign some podcasts, like, you do what you got to do, like, get creative to make sure that your students are hearing as many different perspectives as possible.
Sometimes it takes the students speaking up and protesting and asking for more diversity in the authors that they're reading for educators to finally implement those kinds of changes. I think sometimes educators can be pretty stubborn or set in their ways.
Yes, for sure.
And like thinking about myself, right? Like there are readings that I was trained under that now I want to pass down to my students. But sometimes those readings might not be as effective or as representative compared to what might be out there currently. So like you mentioned, it takes the educator being intentional and reading the materials myself and then being able to implement those changes.
Yeah. And I mean, truly bless Gen Z, like, for having the boldness to make these demands, right? In a way that my elder millennial self would not have had the courage to do. Or maybe it's more like my child of immigrants self. It's probably more of the reason. But yeah. And again, like, this is so much easier said than done. But like, if your response to that kind of challenge is defensiveness, then like, examine that, like, sit with that, like, what is it about that that's threatening to you? So yeah. And I mean, this is a tricky question to answer because I feel like the people who want to do this will do this, are doing this probably already, and the people who don't want to do this are definitely like are not going to be receptive to this advice. So in some ways I feel like these words might reach only the people who already agree with it. But yeah, I would just encourage educators to not perpetuate white supremacy by only putting white voices in front of their students. Yeah.
That is an important point, a powerful point that you're making there. Liz, I have a couple of questions that I ask all guests. So here they are. So one question is, you're an experienced professional in your field. You are post 13 or so years after you got your doctorate. What advice might you have for Christian psychology professionals, for example, PhDs, who are just beginning their careers? And I would especially like to hear, if you don't mind, sort of this non-traditional path that you've taken. You graduated from a clinical psych program, but you didn't become a full-time therapist. You didn't go into the traditional academia. So I would, if you feel comfortable, especially like to hear thoughts and advice related to those who might be considering things outside of academia or clinical work.
Yeah. I love this question so much, and I'm honored to be able to answer it as somebody who, as you said, has not used the degree in a traditional way. I mean, so my advice is maybe predictable, but I think the beautiful thing about having a psychology degree is that there is no field in which a clinical psychology PhD is not going to be an asset to you, right? This is not like a doctorate in architecture where the skills are so specific that they're more or less useless outside of their given field. But like, for me, I've had a string of non-traditional jobs since graduation, and like in every single one, the ability to listen well and empathize and ask thoughtful questions and understand human behavior has been a godsend, a huge gift. It's like only been an asset to me. So I think with that knowledge, I would just encourage folks to just like expand your imagination however possible into what your options are, because I feel like my options when I started grad school were like, I could be a therapist, I could teach, I could do research. And like, that was kind of it. But there's a whole, like, there are so many ways in which you can use this degree. And now my peers are using them like all in just such interesting and cool ways. Like, I have friends who are like working for Fortune 500 companies, like doing employee wellness. I have friends who are in administration. I have friends who are supervising. I have friends who are teaching and doing research and being a therapist. But like, again, like these skills are so applicable across such a wide range of fields that like I would really encourage folks to just like think really broadly about like how they want to use their degree. The other piece of advice is maybe kind of related, but it's like, I think therapy is so important, and I no longer practice as a therapist, but I'm still an evangelist of therapy. It's also really hard to sustain as a full-time job. And so I would encourage folks as much as possible to, if being a full-time therapist gives you life, absolutely do that. But also to kind of like think about your career as a marathon and not a sprint. And like, I know so many people who just like burned out so quickly. And so and so maybe this advice I think goes along with what I said before, where it's like, think about like, there's so many ways you can use the degree. Think about how you can leverage that degree to serve people and care for people. But also you don't have to do it in the form of like full-time therapy, high burnout, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's other ways that you can leverage it. So those are my two pieces of advice broadly. And then in terms of like the non-traditional career, like, I mean, this is a much bigger, this maybe applies, I think, beyond Christian psychologists, but like, I feel like my career has like taken me to places and brought me into work that is like so much more like, it's like meaningful and terrifying and different. Like doing the non-traditional thing is scary because there's just the path is not clear, right? And I feel like by the time you're at the end of a Christian or a psychology PhD, like you have so many very clear steps, and I feel like stepping into the unknown can be terrifying. But I just feel like if you are open to it, like you just the possibilities of like interesting work are generally like limitless with a degree like this. So yeah, I don't know if that's great. It's like not super practical advice. It's not very specific, but
No, I value your advice. I admire you for your courage, because you're right. I think it's a scary place to be when you get your doctorate to not do the thing that your advisor thinks you should take, but to instead pursue other dreams, maybe paths that were not as certain. But I feel like you're a great example of someone who was able to pursue something you're super passionate about in a way that has benefited so many people.
Oh, that's very generous of you, Paul. Thank you. But yeah, it's really interesting. I think I'm curious. I would be curious to hear your take on this too. Like, it's really interesting being at this point, like, between 10 and 15 years after graduation, and seeing what people are doing. Because I don't know about you, but like, I don't really know anybody who is doing full-time therapy. And like, I feel like, as we've gotten older and as people have, started families and have kids, like I feel like the sustainability of the career has taken, or finding work that is emotionally sustainable and like financially compensates you for your time and labor has like, those things have become more important to folks as they've like gotten older, and it just, I mean, I'm sure that some of this is just my millennial self talking because I was told to like follow my dreams and do what I love. And, now I'm like, oh, actually, that's like maybe not perfect advice because, I'm at an age now where like my peers want, and I want to be compensated too. And we want jobs that are going to sustain the rest of our lives. And we don't want to find meaning just in the work in the way that I think a lot of us went into the career thinking about, you know what I mean? So yeah, I don't know. I would be curious to hear your take though. And like, especially as you look around at your peers from when you were in school.
Yeah, I think burnout is very real. And whether you're in a academic position where you're supervising students on therapy, or whether you are in a full-time therapist role, especially in that role, I see a lot of burnout among my peers, or changing of careers in a way that allows them, like you said, more balance. So I do think that there are some people that God made who are made for doing full-time therapy for a long time. There's really gifted people who are somehow protected from burnout, who are able to do that work. And I'm thankful for those peers and those folks around me. I don't think I'm one of them. So I like being in academia. I like teaching. I like doing research. I'm hoping that as sort of a mid-career thing, this kind of public-facing work can also be something fruitful. But I think just being able to introspect and know what your limits are, and like you said, finding that balance between fulfillment but also reality of compensation, I think all of that is super important.
I feel weird saying this because I don't want to discourage anybody, right, who is like in grad school and like wants to help people, you know, because that was me, right? But I do wish that somebody had told me that like burnout in this field is high and very few people are immune to it. As you said, there are some special cases where it's just like, I don't know where your infinite capacity to care for people comes from. I don't have it, you know? And you know, there is a time in life when you will have more like, especially if you're like kind of a traditional, like relatively, you went to grad school relatively soon after college, like there may be a point in your life when you will have more financial obligations, and like things like benefits and a 401k, like it's gonna help your life. And so, I do, you know, I was very, very idealistic as a grad student. And I think a lot of people in helping professions are, and I don't even know how receptive I would have been to this advice, frankly, at the time. But I feel like I'm at a point in my life now where it's like, oh, like the reality of things, like of, you know, what it costs to live in the world financially and emotionally. I think I have like just a much better understanding of that than I did when I was in grad school.
Yeah. And that perspective is valuable. So thank you. My final question is, if you could ask my next guest, I don't know who that person would be, but my next guest, any question about teaching psychology and teaching from a Christian perspective, what might it be?
Yeah, I love this question. I would want to ask them, you know, beyond what you want your students to get out of your class professionally, like the skills or the knowledge you want them to get, like how do you want the students in your class to be shaped personally? Like, how do you want your class to form them as people, both in like the content of what you teach, but also in how you teach it? Like, how do you want them to come out different as a result of taking your class as a person and not just as like a student or a future professional?
Wow. Well, I feel like I could talk on and on about these themes with you, Liz. It's just been a
Likewise.
pleasure to hear about your journey and what you're struggling with, as well as things that have been really rewarding. So thank you. Anything else, Liz, you want to say before we say goodbye or stop the recording?
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real joy to talk with you. And I don't know if people know this, but the reason we know each other is because you were in the intern class ahead of me at our internship site. And so it is meaningful to kind of like circle back. For me, it will be, 12 years later. And just to like check in when we're at this like very different stage of our lives. And so I'll like to say that I appreciate this like kind of full circle moment. So thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome. And thank you for being on the show. And yeah, same with me. It just brought me back to memories at the counseling center that we were a part of, and
Yeah.
both good and maybe not so good memory
for
when
better
we were
and worse.
interns there. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you for listening to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you'll join us next time.